Hey, coffee lovers. My name is Lucas, and there is no X in espresso. So, I made this channel with a few simple goals in mind. Perhaps the most important is to educate people in the world of coffee. And a big part of that for me is getting everybody excited about coffee. So this video is dedicated to just that. Anyone starting their journey, now is your time to really get excited, and I'll explain exactly why. Whether or not you're tiny bit curious, skeptical, or previously put off, but still just a tiny bit curious, stick around. And even if you're an expert or somewhere in between, there is a good chance that you will find some really good insight when revisiting coffee from seed to cup. First off, what is coffee? It's a wonderful beverage that we all drink, but it started off as a plant from Ethiopia many hundreds of years ago today. The plant itself is grown in an area of the world known as the Coffee Belt. You can find all the countries that grow coffee kind of near the equator. Some notable countries are Brazil, the largest producer of Arabica coffee. Vietnam, the largest producer of Robusta coffee. Panama is the country that grew the record holder for most expensive coffee. So there are lots of countries that grow coffee. And it starts out just as a plant. This little nice, it looks like a little red cherry. It is a beautiful plant. It's when ripe, it is harvested, and then all these plants are taken and they are processed. The good stuff is in the center of this plant. It's technically not a bean. It's more like a seed, but for simplicity's sake, we will call it a bean since that's how we know it. So all the outside cherry stuff or pulp is removed from the coffee in various methods. Another video on that at another time. And sometimes that's how different coffees get their distinct taste. So when all that is removed, the coffees are washed, milled, and you have what is called green coffee. You start out as a plant, and now you have green coffee. If you've seen this before, looks like a coffee bean, but they're much smaller and much more dense, and as the name suggests, they are green, sometimes a bit more yellowish, sometimes even a bit bluish and shiny, depending on the variety or subspecies. So this coffee is what is taken and exported from the coffee growing countries and imported to the coffee consuming countries. The US, with a very few small exceptions, imports all of its coffee, and Western countries import all of their coffee. So it is a big commodity, and that's why the economics of it are so important, but perhaps another video on that later as well. So coffee are stored in these big sacks. They're called burlap sacks, and they weigh something like 70 kilograms, and I don't know what that is in freedom units, but big sacks of coffee. And these are stored in warehouses, stored by sometimes importers, sometimes by roasters, but they do make their way to be roasted. So this is when one of the most important steps happening, the roasting. So we take these big sacks of green coffee and we put them into a giant coffee roaster. And this turns it from something that is just kind of like really hard, really dense. You can't do much with it. You can't even like chew it. You'd break your teeth almost. And you bring it out into the coffee beans that you know. The more brownish tint, the very porous, the very easy to grind up. And so by adding heat to the beans, they release a lot of gas, they release a lot of water, they get much more porous, a lot less dense, so that we can consume them. You can grind them up, you get a lot more surface area for all these chemical reactions, and a lot more chance for us to grab the really tasty stuff. Coffee is roasted to differing degrees some coffee is roasted very light, some coffee is roasted very dark, and some in between. Obviously, the lighter the color, the lighter the roast. The darker the color, the darker the roast. Sometimes with the really, really dark coffee, it'll almost look like charcoal. It'll be a little bit oily because there is a point where coffee starts releasing much more CO2 and starts releasing a lot more oils, but I won't go into too many roasting details. More on that at another time, but the point is, green coffee that we can't really consume unless we want to risk breaking our grinder, to delicious roasted coffee that we can all consume. And so roasters then have these giant barrels of coffee that they either send to their own cafes or start selling to other cafes. And it is at this point where you, the consumer, can go to that cafe and order a cup of coffee, because the baristas take the roasted beans after a few days so they can degas a little bit and brew it. And once it is brewed, there's like so many different ways that you can brew coffee. It is then put into the cup for you to drink. So the point is, like, if we just wanted to drink coffee for the purpose of caffeine, we would all be just consuming, like, it. A lot of these steps wouldn't matter so much. No matter what we're doing, we're always getting that caffeine. In fact, we're losing just a tiny little bit of caffeine in the roasting process. You know, the more we let it in the giant turning oven, the more just the trace amounts go away. So technically, green coffee does have a little bit more caffeine. And so many of these steps wouldn't matter if it were just for the purpose of drinking it to get caffeinated. But that's why taste is so important. We put all this time and effort to growing the right kind of crops, to processing it to the perfect degree, to storing it properly, to roasting it to the optimal temperature so that you can consume it not only to get caffeinated and energized, but to also really enjoy it. There is so much work from seed to cup that is put into you enjoying your beverage. And that's part of why coffee culture, cafe culture is so great, because we're all here getting energized, getting our brains going, and we're really enjoying the beverage that we drink. Cafes are just a fun place to hang out because coffee is a fun thing to drink. So, how do you get started? Firstly, I would suggest seeking out a local cafe. I mentioned that a couple things besides caffeine are really important. Those being the taste of the coffee and the culture around it. There's a good chance that once you find a good local spot, people working there will know what they're doing with coffee, have better suggestions for what you should drink, and that the quality of the product they sell you is much higher. And that the atmosphere is much more comfortable and inviting. Having worked at big name chains, I know firsthand that the quality of the product and the customer experience are not priorities. That a lot of people can be turned off of the idea right away after having a bad cup or a really bad experience. Again, coffee is something for all of us to enjoy, not just shovel caffeine into our system. I'm going to hugely emphasize getting something local, or at the very least, a smaller chain that's locally owned. Even if they don't roast their own beans, you can still find out where they're from and be certain of the quality and the freshness. Once you're there, you can try out different things. To find out what you prefer, just ask questions. If you find a good place, your barista will have good suggestions. I'm not going to force my taste on everybody. We all like different things. The only thing I will say is to avoid the ultra sugary drinks. I know it's a controversial thing to say, especially in the US, but the goal is to taste the coffee, and in some cases the quality of the milk texture, but definitely not the sugary syrups. Seasonal drinks can be a wonderful treat once in a while. I'm guilty of having, the occasional maple bourbon latte or peppermint mocha, but as a regular thing, I just avoid. Try a cup of house coffee, an Americano, a cappuccino, an espresso. All of these drinks are delicious if done correctly. But if after a couple tries you still can't commit yourself to one, be adventurous and try something else. Developing your palate, getting a sense of what you like, what you don't like, that's all part of the experience. Once you know what you like, it may be time to start home brewing. I will make videos on in-depth recipes for certain brewing methods, but getting started is not hard or scary at all. I'm not going to suggest the automatic single-serving devices, mostly because you cannot guarantee the freshness of the product you're brewing, and there is little to no wiggle room for you to optimize your recipe. It's tempting to just press the button and go first thing in the morning, but in my opinion, the loss in quality is not worth it. So I will make some suggestions for getting started with making your own coffee at home. For any brewing, I hammered in the importance of freshness. And this is part of why finding your own local cafe is so important. They will most likely have 12-ounce whole bean bags that you can buy that have the exact date of roast on them. If you don't have a grinder at home, this is still fine. You can ask for it to be ground at any setting. Automatic drip, French press, cold brew, pour over, you name it. Now for your brewing hardware. You may have an automatic drip machine already, one of those Mr. Coffees lying around in an old appliance closet or in the basement. If you do have one of those and you like hot coffee, I would start here. Get your beans ground for automatic drip or just paper filter, and then it's just a matter of putting in the filter, dosing out the coffee and water appropriately. I go with about 1 part coffee to 16 parts water by weight, and pressing the button. It's simple and it's miles better than the automatic single serving methods I mentioned earlier. If you want to go one step fancier with your hot coffee, get a V60 or simple cone that goes right on top of your cup. A couple of disadvantages for beginners though. It requires a lot more setup hardware in that you need the actual cone and you'll have to boil and pour your own hot water, and it will only make about 1 or 2 cups at a time. So not just something you can press a button and forget about. However, a big advantage is there is much more wiggle room in the brewing process. Check out my extraction video. Now, maybe you like cold coffee. Something that is sold everywhere and hugely popular during the summer is cold brew. Like everything, I will make a dedicated in-depth video on this style of brewing eventually. Many companies will sell very fancy, dedicated cold brew equipment, often quite expensive, and it may seem like a turnoff, but nobody needs that to start. The wonderful thing about cold brew is that it requires almost no initial setup hardware. Just very coarsely ground coffee, some kind of large brewing container, a filter, and water. That's it. Dose out your coffee, and for cold brew I do about 1 part coffee to 8 parts water by weight. In a container of any size, maybe you want to do just a single serving, or maybe you want to do a batch for the whole week. Pour the water on top, cover it, and let it sit for at least 12 hours. In the morning, when it's done, just pour that mixture through a filter and then serve it over ice. Simple, delicious, great for the summertime. So thanks everyone for watching this video. I hope it was at least insightful, informative, and maybe made a couple people curious about, yeah, maybe I can get into coffee. Hopefully there's enough information in that regard. If you have any further questions about anything I talked about or anything coffee related, let me know down in the comments section. Like the video if you liked it, and stay tuned for other videos, more in-depth brewing, more talking about the industry, talking about what really goes into this whole supply chains of coffee by subscribing. But in the meantime, I am done for this one, so I'll see everyone in the next video. Thanks again for watching. Take care now. Bye-bye.